All right, so today we're going to talk about the Crusades. Yesterday we talked about how exactly the Christian and Islamic religions intersected. Remember how we talked about Abraham and Sarah and their children, Isaac and Ishmael, and how Ishmael was part of the people who will become the Muslims, whereas Isaac was part of the people who will become the Jewish people, and then the Christians. So we were talking about how Jerusalem was a really important place, a really important city for a lot of different religions, including Islam and Christianity and Judaism. So today we're going to talk about the Crusades, which is that holy war, that religious war for control of what we talk about the being the Holy Lands. So the Crusades, they were just a series of religious wars. Christians were the ones who started them to take Jerusalem and the area around it back from the Muslims. And remember, like I just said, a lot of religions consider this land holy. But the biggest thing for Christians is that they believe that Christ would only come again if Christians held Jerusalem. So by the 1000s, Jerusalem had fallen to control of a group of people known as the Fatimids, and they were a group of Muslims from North Africa. And they sort of allied with Turkish Muslims who, in the meantime, had been taking control of Persia, had defeated the Byzantine army. And so the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, he feared that these Muslims will soon overtake Constantinople. Remember, that's the capital city in the Byzantine Empire, the eastern portion of what used to be the Roman Empire. So he turns to the west and he turns to the Pope for help. And so the Pope at this point in time, his name is Pope Urban II. He calls church leaders to a council in France, and he's talking about how dangerous the Muslims are, how they've taken over their Holy Land and have desecrated it and have ruined it. And he calls on Christian warriors to fight against the Turkish Muslims. And so by the hundreds, people are volunteering to take part in the crusade. And their slogan was, as you see it down here, God wills it. So this is part of the speech that Pope Urban II gives as a call to the Christian warriors. He says, "On this account, I," and then he makes sure he says, "or rather the Lord, begs you as Christ's children to publish this everywhere and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race," so he's talking about the Muslims here, "from the lands of our friends. Moreover, Christ commands it." So he's saying that Christ commands people to go and fight against these Muslims. And then check out this part. He says, "All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea or in battle against the Muslims, shall have immediate remission of sins." That means they'll be forgiven of all of their sins. And the Pope says, "This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. Oh, what a disgrace if such a despised and base race, which worships demons," Muslims don't worship demons, should conquer a people which has the faith of an omnipotent God and is made glorious with the name of Christ. So basically, he's saying no matter what you do while you're over there fighting in the Crusades, it doesn't matter if you rape, pillage, kill, whatever, you're going to be forgiven of your sins and you're going to get into heaven. So that is the main idea of what the Pope is saying here. So, 9 organized crusades leave Europe between the years of 1096 and 1291. And in the very first crusade, the people split into 2 groups. We have the first group, which were made up of mostly peasants who had felt called by God to go to war in the crusades, but they had never really been in war before. So they really didn't fare well. Most of them were killed. And the second group were people who had been trained in the art of war. They were knights, but they still weren't prepared for their journey because they didn't take enough food, they didn't take enough water. And so as they were doing Christ's work, going into the Holy Land to get Jerusalem back, they were looting towns and stealing people's food along the way. So after 3 years, the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem. They walked there, most of them. They fought and they win Jerusalem and create 4 states within the Holy Land. And so these were supposed to be sort of strongholds against future Muslim conquests in the region, but unfortunately for the Christians, the Muslims start to recapture lands they had lost. And so there was another call for a crusade at this point in time. This was about 50 years after the first one. So the second crusade was pretty much a failure and took no lands back from the Muslims. And the third crusade, there was a new Muslim leader in the area. His name was Saladin, and he is setting out to take back the states that the Crusaders had won beforehand. So Saladin manages to drive out the Christians who were still there. And then the Pope calls for a third crusade. So, three kings set out from Europe, only one of them makes it there. So, one of them goes back home after the first victory, another one drowns on the way, and the third one is King Richard the Lion Hearted. And he is the one that reaches the Holy Land. And he and Saladin are, duking it out, dueling. It ends in a draw. And so they agree that neither of them won. And so in the picture you see here, you can see the Crusaders are surrendering to Saladin and the other Muslims in the area. So 6 other crusades follow this third one, but none of them are successful. And by 1291, the Christians pretty much just gave up. The Muslims had driven them out of the Holy Land, and there really was no going back to it. So, effects of the Crusades. A lot of the lords, remember, they were having to pay for the Crusades out of their own pocket. So, a lot of the lords back in Europe actually sold off land to pay for the Crusades. And then a lot of the other nobles that were living in Europe, they died during the Crusades. So, it leaves all of their lands open and vulnerable. And that meant that it sort of got snatched up by whichever king was in control of that land. And so land and power began to be centralized, which remember we said yesterday and the day before that land is the equivalent of power in the Middle Ages. So these kings were becoming more and more powerful as they were snatching up these lands left over by these nobles. And also, for that reason, results in the decline of feudalism. If the kings aren't doling out land again, that means that people aren't making those feudal contracts. But a really good part of the Crusades is even though they were pretty much a failure in and of itself, there was a lot of goods and ideas that were exchanged. So this expanded the Silk Road, meant that people were exchanging ideas like Islam and Buddhism. Both religions are being expanded in this way. And merchants are growing filthy rich trading these new goods. So we've got silk from China. We've got jewels from Africa. We've got spices and rice and grains and ivory and all of that from India. And so there are some really great things happening in Europe as a result of the expansion of the kinds of goods that are made available. All right, so we're going to stop there for 1 second.